Hey everyone, I hope you all are doing well. This week we are exploring mediated social world. We've already talked a good bit about, how digital spaces relate to various gender dimensions of social power we've already talked about. But this week we are delving into particular digital spaces that, we do see reinforcing various aspects of inequality in digital spaces. So thinking about specifically the ways that inequalities that take shape in physical spaces manifest in digital spaces as well, and brainstorming interventions in physical and digital spaces in order to remedy various forms of inequalities and promote various forms of social change that push back against these inequalities. So we're first thinking about dating apps, and we're thinking about Molly Neeson's piece Love Inc., where she delves into how we can understand dating apps through an intersectional lens, and how key it is to analyze various dating apps through an intersectional lens. So thinking about first the ways that we can historicize various dating apps, and think about the connection that these dating apps share to generating revenue and profits, and how key it is to understand the emergence of various dating apps within particular structures of political economy and how that influences cultural politics. So, as we've talked about in this class, thinking about how, those dynamics of capitalist structures both impact not only how we understand political and economic relations, but also how we understand the ways that we relate to one another in social and cultural life. So, in other words, thinking about the ways that dating apps really do engender different forms of competition, that they really do, reinforce various, standards of attractiveness and beauty that are rooted in, supporting various forms of industry that profit off of insecurity and whatnot. So, we're first thinking about the ways that, within digital apps, so, within, various forms of dating sites, how, different forms of inequality take shape. So, we're first thinking about, for instance, how non consensual fetishization takes shape. We're thinking about how different forms of harassment, based on identity and experience, take shape on these apps and whatnot. So, thinking about the ways that, people are demeaned and marginalized based on their identities through their use, on dating apps and whatnot. So, in thinking about how people's experiences on dating apps reflect those different dynamics of harassment and fetishization and whatnot, we're thinking about the ways that, it's so important to emphasize how digital spaces are not disconnected from physical social realities. So, once again, thinking about the ways that digital spaces really do, in various senses, reinforce different forms of inequality within different digital platforms and whatnot. So, not only do digital spaces represent, and these dating apps represent how digital realms operate in tandem with different structures of power. We are also thinking about how these spaces are both and spaces. So, they can do this work of reinforcing different modes of inequality, yet they can be these really powerful spaces for subverting different forms of inequality. So, thinking specifically about dating apps, the different ways that, different transformative connections can, emerge through these different dating apps, that, different bonds of solidarity, even, people that, use different dating apps for, discovering different forms of platonic relationships and friendships and whatnot. They can be really important sources of, cultivating key senses of community and, really bringing people together in various ways. So that in and of itself, having this capacity to inspire joy and community that can, subvert different forms of power structures in profound ways. So, we're also thinking about the ways that dating apps can, place this undue cultural taxation on marginalized folks to educate those with privilege. So, thinking about how, there's this effort taking shape called Kinder Grinder, for instance, that is seeking to intervene where, racism, transphobia, and fat phobia takes shape on dating apps. And, it's thinking about the ways that all of these different interactions that take shape on dating apps, how, different forms of discrimination will take shape, as well as, like I was mentioning, these different instances of, undue cultural taxation. So in other words, this pressure for people, from marginalized positions to educate, those with various dimensions of privilege. So, the efforts like Kinder Grinder, and I'm curious what people do think about this, if you think it's an effective intervention, if you think that, it's it could be helpful, but it needs a little bit of work, a little bit of tweaking, or if it's something that dating apps can't necessarily effectively intervene in these inequalities. I'm curious what the various perspectives are out there on this. But thinking about how and I'll link this effort in the discussion board. But Kinder Grinder is releasing all of these different videos that educate people on how different forms of racism and transphobia and fat phobia take shape in the app and whatnot. And it's intended to also expand different discrimination reporting. So thinking about, are efforts like this, really going to do work to, push the app forward and influence people's hearts and minds to, change in various ways and help them see, how, racism, transphobia, fat phobia takes shape and whatnot. And will it actually alleviate that undue cultural taxation that happens for different users that wind up having interactions where different, forms of, systemic privilege and oppression show up in their interactions, and then they need to, address it in various ways? Is it, going to meaningfully alleviate that burden? So we're also thinking about Lisa Nakamura's piece this week where, she talks about how we can understand the labor that women of color put into educating people in social media spaces as another manifestation of that undue cultural taxation that takes shape in social media spaces to educate, those with privilege in various ways. So, she thinks about how the different dynamics of call outs can, do this really important work of, offering vital forms of education, but then she thinks about how do we conceptualize and account for as well as value the labor that she sees various women of color putting into engaging in these different forms of education. So we may think about how even in our own experiences, seeing through comment threads, seeing through how people are interacting with various people with followings on social media, or even between our circles of friends, how different conversations take shape, and seeing the various forms of pressure to educate that different marginalized folks will experience, and then thinking about the different dynamics around what does it look like for people to preserve their energy and draw boundaries where a conversation is not necessarily going anywhere and it's not necessarily enhancing someone's perspective. So thinking about in other words, where do we draw the line between, an unproductive conversation and, a conversation that, is in various ways meaningfully, supporting folks through, gaining education on that. But even thinking about when that meaningful education is taking shape, how do we, alleviate the burden for those who are always in this position to educate those with different dimensions of privilege? So that will be the key question for this week that I do want to hear people's thoughts on. How do we generally, alleviate that burden for marginalized folks to engage in all these different forms of education that so often happen in social media spaces? Yeah, and I look forward to talking with you all.